Recently on my Instagram stories, I asked people what their biggest challenge was to making meals from scratch at home, and I got a lot of really great answers, from time to creativity and menu planning to dishes. And while there is not a single tip or trick that's going to eliminate these challenges altogether, today I hope to offer some helpful tips to maybe reduce the overwhelm. We spend a lot of time in the kitchen. We have really noticed the impact that making good and nourishing meals has on our lives, and to us, it is worth it. But it is a lot of time and it is a lot of work. However, there are ways to become more efficient, mindset shifts that can occur, ways to make it approachable and not quite so overwhelming, especially if you're starting out in learning how to cook from scratch. So I just want to share some of the things that I've learned today to address some of these concerns that people have when it comes to making meals at home. So the number one thing that people mentioned was time, and that makes sense because it takes a lot of time to plan a meal, look up recipes, go shopping for the food, cook the food, clean up from cooking the food. However, there are ways to make it more efficient, and it doesn't have to be such a drain that it's impossible. It can be challenging, but it's not impossible. So one thing to do is to prioritize those foods that yield more foods. For instance, if I make a big pot of broth, then I can have that broth in my fridge and I can use it to make some other meals very quickly. Soup is one, obviously. I can use it in place of water for rice, and that just ups the taste and the nourishment of rice. You can use it to boil vegetables, but my time in cooking the broth has eliminated a lot of the time in those other food items that I can cook in my kitchen. Sourdough is another example of this. Having a starter means that making bread or buns or pancakes does not take as much time as if I was starting from scratch, and so that's something else that I found to be greatly beneficial in my kitchen. It's also really helpful to have a prep day, and that might sound a little bit overwhelming, but I've found that really increases the efficiency in the kitchen. If I am chopping carrots for a soup on Monday, then I can also chop the carrots to have with meatloaf on Thursday, and I can also chop some carrots to give to the kids as a snack during the week. And I'm doing it all at one time instead of having to pull out my tools each day that I want to have carrots. It also seems really helpful to get all the dishes dirty at once and not have to worry about cleaning up the kitchen so often. Obviously, you're always gonna have tidying to do during the week, but to really get in there and get a big mess going and get all your food prepped as much as possible and then clean up at the end of the day has been very helpful. Lastly, it's really important to have good tools in the kitchen. I cannot tell you how many times I have watched somebody cooking on Instagram or social media and I see them chopping vegetables with like a tiny paring knife. It makes me cringe, not only because it's not very safe, but because it takes so much longer, and having good tools can really make that process faster. I have a really nice, big, sharp chef's knife, and it makes chopping vegetables a breeze. I would say a really good cutting board, a good chef's knife, a good cast iron skillet, and an Instant Pot are some of those tools that I use most often in the kitchen. Oh, and an immersion blender. I just got an immersion blender, and that's really handy as well. I really like chopping vegetables with a knife, so it's something that I like to do, but you can also buy cool mandolins or vegetable choppers that can make that process a lot faster as well if that's more your style. So just find those tools that help you to be efficient in the kitchen and get tasks done in a timely manner. The next one that people mentioned was overwhelm, and I totally understand that because it can be very overwhelming when you have a goal or you want to be here and you feel like you're here and that distance in between feels insurmountable. My tip for that is just to take it one thing at a time. Don't look at your entire diet and decide you're gonna overhaul it tomorrow. Don't go into your pantry and throw everything away because it has bad ingredients and you don't want to be eating them anymore. Just take it one thing at a time. Incorporate one food, learn one recipe, and then keep doing that until that's comfortable and you feel confident in it, and then you can add something else. I always recommend people start with broth because it's not very difficult, and like I mentioned before, the impact can be really big on the rest of your meals. Another place I like to suggest people start is food dye. This is definitely an ingredient that we avoid in our home, and the great thing is there are lots of alternatives available now that you can usually find something to replace what you had been using in the past if the previous item has dye in it. So for instance, there are lots of cereals or yogurts, even medications, that you can find dye-free versions. Sourdough is another one. If your family eats a lot of bread items, then you can make really good quality, even organic bread for a fraction of the cost that you would pay if you were buying it pre-made at the grocery store. Sourdough is basically salt, water, and flour. And even though salt and water do cost some, the main cost there is going to be the flour. And I can buy 20 pounds of organic unbleached flour at Costco for $16.23, I think it is, less than $17. You can make a lot with that 20 pounds of flour. And once again, like I mentioned before, once you have a starter going, it is so simple to make things from it. Breakfast is another good place to start. A lot of the standard American diet breakfast foods are pretty empty as far as nourishment goes and have a lot of sugar in them. I've noticed such a huge impact on the rest of my day when I start with a really good nourishing breakfast. But don't then say, okay, I'm gonna go from eating cereal and Pop-Tarts every day to cooking from scratch 7 days a week. That's overwhelming. Start with one day. Come up with a breakfast that you really enjoy. Maybe it is a piece of toast with jam and some scrambled eggs. Maybe it's a fried egg with toast. That's my personal favorite. Got used to making some of these breakfast foods and then maybe slowly start to incorporate it more often. Now 3 days a week you cook from scratch, and then maybe it's 4 days a week. Look up recipes for things that you can make at home that maybe could replace some of the other options you've been eating, like waffles or pancakes. Can you make that from home? Can you make it with better ingredients? That is a way that you can slowly change breakfast foods. But once again, it doesn't have to be overnight and it shouldn't be overwhelming. Start with a small step that you can manage and then work from there. One more quick note on this is that as you begin to cook more and more meals from scratch, obviously there's going to be more and more of a time commitment, but some other things become a little bit easier. And sourdough is a good example of that. Once I have my starter going, making bread takes a lot less time than it did when I was making it with yeast. The process of making an overnight loaf of sourdough is literally so easy I could do it in my sleep. I often probably do. It's not that complicated anymore. Same goes for the broth, and there are other items that are like that. As you are in the kitchen and as you learn those processes, you're going to be adding more tasks, but you're also going to be making some of those tasks a lot easier once you get that snowball rolling. Ability is another thing that people mention. Really, there's no substitute for practice and time. You have to spend time in the kitchen, and as you do, you're going to get more confident and your abilities are going to grow. I have failed so many times in the kitchen. I have been unable to keep a starter. I'm yet unable to make a ferment. I have not been able to successfully ferment a vegetable. That's on my goal for 2023. But the point is that you're going to fail, and the only way that you can get to a place where you're not failing is to practice. Little successes are going to boost your confidence. When I was able to successfully keep a starter, then I got a lot more confident in my experimentation with that. Taking those small little steps and being able to check those off your list or put those skills under your belt is going to really help you as you move forward in the kitchen. The next one was knowledge, and just like everything else, this is going to take time too. I've been reading about food and nutrition for almost 6 years now, and I'm still learning so much and unlearning so much. So it really is just a process of reading, exposing yourself to the kind of content that you want to intake. I like Nourishing Traditions as a book. I think that's a great book to read to kind of familiarize yourself with how our bodies work, how they react to certain foods, and what our dietary goals should be. I think it's really important to stay humble and also to stay curious. It can be kind of depressing if you have thought a certain way and then you read something and you realize that maybe you were wrong, and that can feel like you're taking a step back. We can only do our best with the information that we have at the time. But a spirit of curiosity about these things, and also I would say awe and wonder at how our bodies work and how individual our bodies are. This has allowed me to meet new information with less fear and more excitement maybe, and just be able to constantly be swiveling and changing and making adaptations as I grow and learn. Lack of creativity was another one, and this is probably one of my biggest current challenges, is that it can get very dull and monotonous when you're having a lot of the same foods and ingredients over and over. A couple things that help me are to follow other homesteaders, homemakers, home chefs, and get inspiration from them. Farmhouse on Boone is an account that is on Instagram, also on YouTube, and she has lots of videos where she goes through and shows you what she eats in a week, and that's something that's very inspiring to me. It's something that I have for a long time been doing over on Instagram as well, so shameless plug for myself. I try to give meal inspirations also, but even I come across those brick walls sometimes, those weeks where I'm like, I don't know what to make, what can I make? Pinterest has been a huge help in that. I like to be able to look on Pinterest for recipes. I have 2 boards on Pinterest. They're the only ones that I use. One is for this week's menu and the other is for those recipes that I have made and I love. So I save them there so that I can reference them again and again when I want to. But that has just kind of clarified it for me and given me a place where I can have all of my recipe inspo that's easy to look up and easy to keep track of. I think menu planning is just, it's so huge. It eliminates so much mental stress and decision fatigue, and I know a lot of people think that it's a lot of work, and it is, but you can simplify it too. Something that I've done for a really long time that you will see other people do just in different little ways is to kind of categorize my meals. So, okay, we are gonna have a meal with rice. What kind of rice meal do we want? We are going to have a meal with beef or chicken or potatoes. You could do pasta dishes. And when you do that, it becomes a little bit more organized, I think, for then coming up with ideas and saying, okay, here are some rice ideas that I can help pull from. I've even seen people collect all those in a notebook or a cookbook and be able to just go and pick one from each category for the week. Another really big help for me is that we do soup during the week. So I usually make a big pot of soup, and then that's what we have for lunches during the week. The next one was dishes and cleaning. Hire a maid, I don't know, get a robot to do it. My son is always telling me he's going to invent a robot to do the dishes for me, and I'm not a huge fan of AI, but I will take that. So my only tip here would be to try to avoid having superfluous kitchen items. For instance, instead of having 6 spatulas that you use each time you need it throughout the day and they all end up in the sink to be washed at the end of the evening, you have 1 spatula that you wash in between and then reuse. That can just help with the dishes buildup. I don't recommend having scarcity in the kitchen where you actually don't have the tools you need to make your job easy, but just using wisdom in what you're bringing in and if you have maybe too many of them. Energy and exhaustion was another one, and it does take a lot of energy to spend time in the kitchen. A tip I would have for this is that while you're doing the work of cooking, do the tiny bit of extra work and make double. There are very few foods that can't be frozen. I love to utilize cookie sheets to freeze things in individual portions, pancakes laid out, casseroles cut into individual portion sizes and frozen on a cookie sheet. Then you can bag it all together and have it contained, but then it's really easy to just pull out the amount that you need when you need it. That will make having a meal on hand very simple for those days where you just can't handle being in the kitchen. Once again, I'm gonna keep saying it, but having those staples like broth in your fridge, it does not take a lot of effort to make rice with broth. And when I cook broth, I actually use a whole chicken, so then I have the meat from that bird, the cooked shredded chicken meat that I keep in my freezer, once again frozen on that sheet pan and then bagged. And if you have that broth and that chicken, then you can make a really delicious meal in minutes by taking some of the broth, cooking some rice in an Instant Pot. It's literally could not be easier. Taking the chicken, throwing it into a skillet with some butter or your fat of choice, adding maybe a sauce or don't, and putting it on the rice with maybe some frozen vegetables. And there you have a really delicious and nourishing meal that didn't take very much effort. The same can go with sourdough starter. Having bread and then buying Costco has a turkey breast that I like to slice for sandwiches. You can have a simple sandwich. Making mayonnaise is also not very difficult, especially if you have an immersion blender. So all of these things can be done or pulled together in not very much time to make some yummy meals. You don't have to spend hours in the kitchen every single night. Another element of this is you're going to feel better as you eat better food. And it's kind of like one of those things, which comes first, the chicken or the egg? You have to get over that initial hump a little bit in order to see those results, but it's just the kind of thing where taking it one step at a time, like I said before, is going to slowly get you there. Your progress is going to be progress. Someone else might make a great big leap and you might take tiny little baby steps, but either way, as long as you're heading in the right direction, that's something to celebrate. Next is motivation. Totally goes with what I was just saying, that the motivation to do the things is often difficult when it comes to food because the results are not instant. I will be 100% honest. I had wanted to change our diet for a really long time. I had been studying how diet plays into conditions like eczema and asthma because my husband has those conditions. I was studying this long before we had children who suffered with some of those issues as well. And yet I never made any progress because I didn't have a pressing need. But when my son had rashes and hives all over his body, then I honestly had no other choice but to adopt these, and very quickly. I definitely did it more the cold turkey method, and I don't recommend it. It was incredibly stressful. So this one is just going to be the same concepts that I've already talked about, taking it one step at a time, finding one task, one recipe, one habit change that you can make that is most important to you, that you want to prioritize, and getting that down. Another thing is just to celebrate the small wins. Post a picture of your food, be proud of it, invite somebody over for dinner, elevate and give your food that you've spent so much time preparing the attention that it deserved by maybe setting a place at the table, putting a little candle there as you eat. You don't even have to have anyone with you. Turn on some really pretty violin music. I love to eat with some nice classical music playing in the background. Do something like that and really allow yourself to savor the progress that you're making. Celebrate that win and then move on to the next thing. Lastly, your partner. So someone said that their biggest hurdle is their partner likes to eat out, and it was said by my friend, it was said a little bit in jest, but I did want to touch on this for a minute because I think it's important to note that we are not the parents of our partners, and we can make decisions and we can have convictions over what we want to incorporate in our lives, and that doesn't necessarily mean that the people around us, as dedicated and convinced as we are to the merits of what we're doing, are going to adopt the same things. Stress is another thing that's very impactful to our health, so you can have a very nourishing, perfect menu and your health is still going to suffer if you live a life of high stress. And that is why I think it's important to have a really balanced perspective as you're taking on the task of learning about ingredients and cooking at home from scratch, because you can't allow yourself to be overwhelmed by the ingredients you're seeing, the progress or speed of the progress that you're making, or the people around you. Your partner still loves to eat Doritos. I don't think it's worth it to be so uptight about that and so stressed out that you put strain on yourself and your relationship. I also feel like having conversations and open dialogue is not only healthy but very helpful, and I am not saying that you shouldn't have these conversations with the people that you love, but I also think it's important to not carry the weight of other people's journeys and convictions on your back. Obviously, these topics could be talked about at length with lots of very specific examples that I don't have time for in this YouTube video. But if you do follow me on Instagram, these are the kinds of things that I talk about a lot. I often will take pictures of my menu plans to give you inspiration, and I hope to come out with more resources that are a little bit more structured in the future. If you have a particular hurdle in the kitchen or a tip to make one of these a little bit easier, you can definitely leave a comment. I would love to have the dialogue. But just remember, practice makes progress. Don't be afraid to get in the kitchen, roll your sleeves up, make mistakes, and then succeed and celebrate those wins.